The Dyatlov Pass incident isn't remarkable because 10 hikers couldn't make the trip. That happens all the time. This is the middle of winter in Siberia after all. The majority of people on this planet couldn't survive that place in the middle of summer. No, it's because of the absolutely bizarre circumstances that they were eventually found in. Nothing can explain why expert hikers had clawed their way out of their own tent, only to fling themselves into the wilderness, where they'd later be found, barely dressed, burned, their internal organs ruptured from the inside out, leaving their dangerously irradiated bodies scattered in the snow miles away from camp. It's exactly as weird as it sounds. Strap in and get ready for one wild ride, because the Dyatlov Pass is one of the great mysteries of this century. Let's get into it. The year was 1959, and Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, gathered 9 other hikers from the university to undertake a hike into the Siberian wilderness. The majority of them were Grade 2 certified hikers with ski tour experience, and after this trip, they'd all received their Grade 3 hiker's certification, the highest degree of certification that the Soviet Union issued. In the 1950s, getting the top certification was a big deal, and it still is today. There are very few places in the world that are as hard to scale as the Siberian wilderness. Any survivalist, hiker, or mountaineer who can reach Grade 3 in Russia is at the top of their game. People with this kind of experience are still highly sought after. That's also why the hikers were so young. This is not an old man's game. Think of it as a professional sportsman's golden years. You're in your prime between the ages of 17 and 30. After that, your performance starts to decline. So don't go into this thinking that these guys were wet behind the ears. They'd been preparing for this since they were 10 or 11 years old, and they were all smart enough to be studying engineering. They'd chosen late January to early February specifically because this is the most brutal time to make the trip, since it's the heart of the winter. So let's look at the group first, shall we? I'm going to refer to a lot of them by their first names only, because I'll just butcher the pronunciations. I'll probably do a terrible job of the first names too, but I'll try to keep the cringe at a minimum. As I mentioned, the leader was Igor Dyatlov. Next was Yuri D, age 21. Then came Georgy, who went by the nickname Yuri. So to avoid confusion between him and Yuri D, we'll stick to Georgy, and he was 23. Alexander, 24. Rustem, 23. Nikolay, 23. Semyon, who was the oldest at 38. And finally, the only 2 women were Ludmila, age 20, and Zenaida, 22. Zenaida and Nikolay had already completed their Grade 3 certifications, with Zenaida having done it 3 times over in the past. The 10th member was yet another Yuri, but he turned back just 2 days into the hike because of some health issues that prohibited him from continuing. Thank goodness. Could you imagine keeping 3 separate Yuris straight? He left them on January the 28th, just as they reached a trucking town that is the last inhabited village in the north. After this point, they only had the Siberian freeze ahead of them. There were no people out there to help them after this point. Well, that's only sort of true. This area is home to Russia's indigenous people, the Manzi. Now there's a whole lot of history here, but to make a long story short, the Manzi are reindeer herders, fishers, and hunters that live like their ancestors have for thousands of years. They don't observe the traditional Russian Orthodox religion. Instead, they still adhere to shamanistic beliefs centered around their icy natural landscape. They aren't a populist group by any stretch of the imagination, and the likelihood of the group encountering them were virtually zero, since the Manzi were already confined to their permanent winter camps. Moving on, the team of 10 went down to 9, but Yuri, with the rheumatism, swore that they were in good spirits when he left them. They had all the necessary gear, they were organized and prepared, and looked every bit like a group that would be getting their coveted certifications in 3 weeks' time. Their return date was set to the 12th of February. It's thanks to the group's meticulous diary entries for those first 5 days that we got a pretty good idea of how their journey went from there. On January the 31st, they reached a valley tucked in the shadow of the Otorten Mountains, which had the straightest route to what would later become Dyatlov Pass. Unfortunately, a snowstorm forced the group to choose another path to get there. To do this, they had to travel up another mountain called Kholat Syakhl. In the indigenous Manzi language, this translates to Dead Mountain, not because it's necessarily a scary place, but because the Manzi never found any game there to hunt. They actually met a lone Manzi hunter while following one of the hunting paths, though this meeting was just mentioned in passing in the diary, so it's assumed that it was an unremarkable run-in. That night, it got down to -40 degrees with winds so intense that it could whip a man's skin off his face. They had no choice but to stall their trek for the day, taking shelter in their tent as low in the valley as they could. They could use what little trees there were to shield them from the wind until the storm blew itself out. The final entry was made by Dyatlov, where he noted how warm and comfortable the tent was, despite the deep cold outside. They had a stove with them that heated the tent as well as cooked their meals, so they were definitely not in any imminent danger from the elements inside their shelter. And then the diary entries stopped. 3 weeks went by and none of them arrived in time to send the expected telegraph from the trucking town to let their sport club know that they made it. Given the rough terrain and several storms during that time, searchers waited a while, expecting them to turn up a few days late due to understandable weather delays. It wasn't until the 26th of February, almost 2 weeks after they were supposed to have returned, that search parties went out to look for them. It didn't take them long to find the camp, and here's where it gets weird. It was obviously abandoned for several weeks. The tent had collapsed under snow buildup, and it was torn apart. The snow buildup was from snowfall from the sky. The tent was not buried under it. That's a very important point I need to make here, because it's very clear that the tent hadn't been buried by an avalanche. It had been abandoned out in a flat plain. The tears in the tent were cut open from the inside, and all of the group's skis were stacked outside the opening. Traversing across the landscape without skis is nearly impossible, and anyone who tries to do so is asking for frostbitten legs. Almost all of their gear, cameras, shoes, and clothes was still inside the tent, except for what they were wearing when they left. Everything else was still where it was left behind. Apparently, they'd cut themselves out of the tent and fled into the night with only the clothes on their backs. On the 27th, the searchers found the first 2 bodies. 1 mile away from the tent, they found Georgie and Yuri D. under a cedar tree next to a fireplace where they'd apparently tried to keep warm. Several of the tree's branches were broken, and judging by the scrapes and bruises on the body's hands, they tried to climb the tree. Neither man was wearing any shoes and barely any clothes. Georgie had burned one of his feet and his hands in an attempt to keep warm, and his body showed signs that it had been moved after death. He had abrasions on his knuckles. It's highly likely that they died first and the others undressed them after death so that they could keep warmer. Both men were severely bruised, indicating that they fell out of the tree while climbing it. Yuri D. was hurt enough that there was foam rising from his lungs that had frozen on his mouth. Though he didn't die from his injuries, he had bruised knuckles and injuries on his face, indicating that he'd been in a fight as well as falling from the tree. Georgie showed the same kind of injuries, and he'd bitten his own right hand. The flap of skin was found inside his own mouth. As macabre as this is, it was probably an involuntary reaction during the last seconds of his life. The branches they'd cut down were clearly cut with a tool, yet none was found with them. 480 meters away was Rustem. He had 1 boot on, several pairs of socks, shirts, sweaters, and pants over each other, but no heavy jacket appropriate for the weather. The watch on his wrist was stopped at 8:45. 850 meters away from the tree lay Zenaida and Dyatlov. Both of them were also dressed in an eclectic mix of clothes, with several hats, socks, and shirts over each other. Only Zenaida was wearing shoes, and Dyatlov's watch stood still at 5:51. Dyatlov had plenty of abrasions and cuts. He was missing a tooth, and his fists were bruised. Zenaida also had bruised knuckles, as well as a swollen cheek and banged-up eyebrow. Rustem, Dyatlov, Zenaida, Georgie, and Yuri D., back at the cedar tree, had gotten into a pretty significant fist fight with each other, with Rustem coming off worst of all. It wasn't until the 5th of May, nearly 3 months later, and when the snow had melted enough, that a Manzi hunter found a discarded sweater and a pair of pants that this new discovery led them to the other 4 hikers' remains. They were found just 75 meters away from the cedar tree at the bottom of a ravine. The fact that they were so far down and probably covered in several feet of snow is why they weren't located during the initial search. They were found inside a den that they'd constructed out of branches and sticks that had collapsed in the months since it was built. Most of the den had fallen into the bottom of a ravine that had a stream running through it. The stream would have been frozen solid when they landed there. The den had been built 6 meters away from the edge of the cliff, making it highly unlikely that it would just have fallen over. It looked more like the people inside and the branches were thrown into the ravine manually. These branches were also cut with a tool of some kind, but that tool was nowhere to be found. All of them were also wearing that odd assortment of clothes pulled over each other, leading investigators to believe that they simply grabbed as much as they could when they left the tent and made up the rest with the two who died first clothes. They had more layers over them than the other 5 had at least. Semyon had a jacket and a pair of slippers over his multiple socks, and Alexander had a very decent ski jacket on, though it was unzipped and had several rips down one of its sleeves, a lot like the tent had. It had probably been taken from one of the 2 bodies beneath the cedar tree after it was ripped when they fell from the tree. Both his feet, covered in 5 pairs of socks, also showed signs of being burned, meaning that these 4 were at the cedar tree before they made the den. Semyon and Alexander died curled up against each other, essentially spooning to keep warm. Ludmila wasn't wearing any shoes either, but she had multiple layers that should have kept her warm enough at least until morning. She was found on her knees, her head leaning against a boulder. Nikolai had a felt jacket and a pair of boots on, making him one of only 3 that were wearing appropriate shoes for the weather, unless you count Rustem with only 1 boot, and Semyon with his slippers. Nikolai did have gloves, but he'd stuffed them inside his pocket. On his wrists were 2 watches. One stopped at 8:30 and the other at 8:14. The first 3 didn't have as many layers on them, so the assumption was simply that they died of hypothermia. But these last 4 did have a lot of layers. Okay, they didn't have a whole lot of shoes or ski jackets among them, but they were bundled up quite well. Ready for the strangeness to dial up to 11? Let's look at their injuries then. Nikolai suffered blunt force trauma to the head that caused a fracture and a brain bleed that killed him a short time after sustaining the injury. He also had an unspecified injury on his right arm. Ludmila's eyes and tongue were missing. Her nose was broken, as were several ribs. Her broken ribs had caused mass internal bleeding, leading to her death. Yet there were no injuries on her chest to explain how her ribs had been broken. Semyon's injuries mirrored Ludmila's. Broken ribs that caused massive internal bleeding, and he even had the missing tongue too. Semyon and Ludmila had minutes to live after receiving their injuries. Alexander, who'd been holding Semyon, apparently died of hypothermia, but the autopsy did mention a deformed neck that could have happened as he froze and thawed out, possibly distorting his neck somehow, as well as a small injury behind his ear that happened after he died. And finally, both Ludmila and Alexander's jackets were radioactive. Yep, you heard that right. And not by an explainable amount either. The levels were high enough to be considered dangerous. All of the bodies, with the exception of Dyatlov, showed signs of being moved after death. The initial theory was that an avalanche came down in the tent, causing crush injuries to the 4 in the den, which supposedly would explain the internal bleeding and head injury that had no external cause. Hold on to that though. There's a hitch with that theory too, and why they leave their tent without shoes or jackets. Aftershocks can cause more avalanches, and the safest thing to do would be to get away from the area as fast as possible. Build that den, wait till morning, and then head back when they were sure everything had settled. The missing eyes and tongues were then eaten by scavengers. The ones who managed to get out without internal injuries had simply frozen to death. Simple, right? Not quite. The 3 with internal bleeding were so badly injured that they wouldn't have been able to walk, let alone make it a mile away from the tent and build a shelter themselves, meaning that they received their injuries after building the den. They couldn't have gotten the injuries from falling into the ravine, den and all. It's only a 2-meter drop, and the sheer magnitude of their injuries would require at least a 10-meter fall, and that's being generous. It would probably cost more than that. And those inside the den also had burns on their socks, meaning that they were all together at the cedar tree first, where Georgie and Yuri D died, because those 2 were the only ones who were badly dressed enough to validate hypothermia. They then abandoned the fire, and one of 2 scenarios happened. They built the shelter where Ludmila, Semyon, Nikolai, and Alexander sustained their injuries and then died, leaving only Zenaida, Dyatlov, and Rustem alive. They tried to make it back to the tent and died of hypothermia along the way. Or they made it to the cedar tree. The first 2 die, and Zenaida, Dyatlov, and Rustem die as they try to find shelter. The last 4 build the shelter, go inside, somehow suffer major injuries, and then die. This is actually a better sequence of events because the shelter was tiny, appropriate to fit 4 people and no more. But the people found inside of it were in no condition to have built it themselves, with the exception of Alexander. But that's a big job for a man to do alone when 3 of his comrades are mortally wounded. After the level of damage they suffered, these 3 only had minutes to live before they drowned in their own blood-filled lungs. Nikolai's head injury was so severe that he'd have lived no longer than 3 hours after receiving the injury. The blow was so massive, he would have been unconscious the moment he got it. He was the only one with outward injuries that led coroners to believe that he'd fallen from the ledge into the ravine and fallen on top of his head. He was then moved inside the den where he died from his injuries. As for their eyes and tongue being missing, why would a scavenger eat just that and leave the rest? No way is anything leaving 4 completely edible corpses behind after just sampling at a tongue and 4 eyeballs. There's no reason they should have left their tent, especially not by destroying it instead of simply leaving through the flap. If we had 9 hikers dead of hypothermia, just scattered randomly around the woods, then we could have chalked it off to mass hysteria and the effects on the brain as nerves start to die in extreme cold. But the 4 hikers in the den, with their massive injuries sustained after leaving a perfectly warm tent, throws this entire thing off. Not to mention, this investigation was conducted in the late 50s, deep in the Soviet Union's rule, leaving us with a lot of reason to question any reports coming out of this investigation. Naturally, the world spent half a century cooking up all sorts of theories, ranging from aliens to Bigfoot, and all the way to a Soviet weapons testing gone wrong, internal crushing laser beams, electromagnetic pulses, and all that spy movie goodness. But then Russia goes and reopens the case in 2020, and we're thrown down a completely new rabbit hole when the new reports come out. The reason Dyatlov was reopened at all was because some engineers theorized that sheet avalanches could have been the cause. Sheet avalanches are incredibly rare and can only happen when a slope is at a very slight angle, not a steep incline. It's when a large, cohesive slab of snow breaks away and slides down a slope as a single sheet. Think of it like a gigantic but thin wooden board sliding off a truck in one singular slab and landing straight down on top of a tiny village, crushing all and their homes flat from above. According to their findings, authorities believed that the group was sure that an avalanche was coming for some reason, or it had already occurred, and they cut themselves out of the tent to make their escape as quick as possible, grabbing what clothes they could carry. They then headed down and climbed the cedar to get to the top branches that weren't as saturated with snow, and therefore appropriate for fire making. The first 2 died because they fell and their injuries hastened hypothermia. The rest took their clothes and built the den, complete with cedar tree branches laid out on the floor to keep them off the snow and ice from the stream. They were not in any danger of freezing to death with their shelter and their layers of clothes. Their internal injuries happened when the den collapsed on top of them because it was badly built, or because the entire den, with them inside of it, fell into the ravine in the middle of the night, causing the crush injuries. Dyatlov, Zenaida, and Rustam survived the incident and tried to get back to the tent, succumbing to the cold on the way. There are 2 major problems with this theory. First, there were no signs of an avalanche in the vicinity, and the flat tent was covered in snow only in its center. The edges were completely clean, meaning that it collapsed after a gradual buildup of snow during perfectly normal snowfall over the course of 3 weeks. An avalanche, even sheet avalanches, would have buried it entirely. Secondly, if the den collapsed on top of the last 4, they'd have been cut up, bruised, and the crush injuries would have been all over their bodies, not just their chests. Ludmila wouldn't have been found leaning against a rock in an upright position. She was moved into that position after she died. So someone must have come in after the den fell or collapsed and moved all of the bodies in some way, leaving 2 of them with radioactive material on them. Yet somehow, Rustam, Dyatlov, and Zenaida come out unscathed. They had no crush injuries at all. And Alexander also didn't have injuries congruent with crushing, yet he stayed behind trying to keep Nikolai alive with his body heat. They were not crushed by the roof of the den, that's for sure. Given how well bundled up they were, they'd obviously taken some time to get dressed, but they were rushed enough that they couldn't take shoes, gloves, and jackets. Semyon was the only one who was truly fully dressed. He was only missing gloves. But there's an even bigger hole in all of this that everyone's missing. The final report doesn't add up at all. We've been running on the assumption that they fled into the night, scrambled around in the dark and made mistakes, like not going deeper into the woods for better cover and building a bad den. That's not true at all. The den was built very well. Chances are that it simply fell apart in the weeks after they'd all died when the water started to thaw. Why did the survivors only try to build one fire? The first thing that they would have done after building the den was to build another undercover, yet they didn't attempt one. Dyatlov and the other two survivors were most likely trying to get back to the tent. At least everyone can agree on that fact. So why flee into the open, with no supplies, from a danger at the tent that was more threatening to their lives than the Siberian winter? And then try to go back to that danger? If the threat was an avalanche, they would have simply hunkered down for a few hours until daylight came and then gone back to get their things. If the threat was a wild animal or people, they'd have fled much farther into the woods. Instead, they stopped at the cedar tree that was in full view of the tent, completely exposed to the elements. So there was no avalanche, no threat from a living source, and apparently no reason to grab only clothes but no shoes to flee from what exactly? And then we haven't even covered the oddity of what seems to have been a major fistfight between 5 people. All of their abrasions and pretty deep cuts that were supposedly from this fight and falling from the tree did not cut through any of their clothes. For goodness sakes, Zenaida showed signs of being kicked in the side. All of their faces looked like they'd been in a bar brawl. Dyatlov had 2 entire slabs of skin missing from his forearm. Their bodies were covered in cuts, yet only one jacket had a torn sleeve. So somehow, they'd gotten all of these cuts deep enough to draw blood while completely naked? Whatever had caused the cuts and bruises had to have penetrated their clothes, but their clothes were completely intact. Only the 4 inside the den did not have injuries consistent with fighting. Are you tired of running in circles yet? Well, the inconsistencies just keep going and going. Let's recap. We have 9 hikers who left a safe tent that was not in any danger, natural or otherwise, to get up to all these perplexing events, and we have no idea in what order they died. Whatever knives or axes they used to build a fire and den had vanished, and all of the knives and axes they'd brought along were accounted for inside the tent that they'd abandoned. So who brought an undocumented knife to the party? And how did it vanish? Somehow along the way, 2 fell from a tree, 5 got into a massive fight, and apparently they fought and climbed the tree while naked and then got dressed afterwards. The ones in the den had crush injuries, yet no explainable external source to explain how they'd sustained them, and the den, it seems, was built only for the 4 of them and no one else, only so that they could die inside of it. 8 of the 9 were moved after their death, yet only 2 of them were undressed so that the others could keep warm. So why move the others if they were just going to leave them out in the open anyway? Their multitude of both minor injuries penetrated their skin but did not damage the clothes covering their skin. Those with major internal injuries had no outward wounds over their broken ribs. They were radioactive, missing tongues and eyes, but showed no other signs of predation. The only real plausible conclusion among the rumble of alien conspiracy theories and Yeti attacks is that there was some human involvement here, and that this whole crime scene was staged. The Manzi tribe aren't really a good fit here. They aren't violent, and how would they have inflicted these injuries without puncturing the hikers' clothes, leaving only some outrageous government experiment involving a death ray, or some pulse that could cause internal injuries, radiation, and mass hysteria among the hikers? I can't see any theory that could fit this incredibly perplexing scene. So unless you have any better suggestions, well, the Dyatlov Pass incident is going to remain a total mystery until the end of time. Comment your theories down below because, man, it's been driving people up the wall for half a century now, and we could all do with some closure. And while you're at it, why not drop a like? And don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next one. Cheers.